There are times when someone reacts so disproportionately to a trivial situation that they are frightened by their own intensity. An insignificant criticism arouses a fury that seems to come from somewhere else. A sincere compliment causes inexplicable discomfort. A real opportunity for change is sabotaged for reasons that even the person themselves cannot name. These episodes reveal something disturbing. There is a stranger living inside each of us. Someone who makes decisions without consulting reason, who chooses exactly what they shouldn't, who runs away from what they most desire. This stranger is not an invader. They are an integral part of who we are, but a part that has been banished, censored, pushed into the basements of consciousness. Freud called this process repression, and perhaps this is one of the most frightening discoveries of psychoanalysis. Much of what we consider our personality is nothing more than a collection of masks created to hide from ourselves what we did not have the courage to accept. The person who knows themselves completely may be the one who knows themselves the least. The most disturbing thing is to realize that this inner stranger is not inactive. They govern professional choices, shape relationships, define what we consider possible or impossible for our lives. They act as an invisible director, orchestrating an existence that seems to be ours but which follows scripts written by desires we don't even know we have. There is a silent pain in this discovery. The pain of realizing that we may have lived for decades trying to please ghosts, avoiding shadows, building an entire life on foundations we don't know. It is the pain of suspecting that much of what we call character may be just the result of impulses that were brutally suppressed in childhood and adolescence. What if the life we have built is not really ours? What if the decisions we are most proud of were made precisely to avoid something we no longer even remember feeling? These questions are not philosophical. They are urgent, intimate, and devastatingly practical. What is most frightening is the possibility that this process is not accidental, that there is a hidden logic governing our most important choices, a force that operates in the shadows of consciousness and silently shapes who we are, a force that we know very little about but that knows us intimately. Freudian repression is not just theory. It is the key to understanding why we repeat patterns that destroy us, why we sabotage what we want most, why our own mind sometimes seems to work against our best interests. It is the explanation for one of the most universal and least talked about experiences of the human condition, the feeling of being a stranger to oneself. Repression is not forgetting. Forgetting is when something simply fades from memory, like the name of a schoolmate or the taste of a childhood dish. Repression is different. It is an active banishment. A force that pushes certain content away from consciousness and keeps it locked there, like an invisible jailer working 24 hours a day. Imagine a library where certain books are locked away in a forbidden section. The books continue to exist, continue to exert influence over the entire library. After all, they dictate which other books can be read, which subjects can be explored, but they remain inaccessible to the conscious reader. Repression works like this. It keeps content active and influential, but out of reach of reason. This mental architecture is built early, usually in childhood, when certain impulses, desires, or experiences are judged unacceptable by family or society. A child who feels anger toward their father and is violently reprimanded may repress not only that specific episode, but their entire capacity to feel anger toward authority figures. Decades later, that person may become an adult who never confronts abusive bosses, who accepts unequal relationships, who somatizes their rebellion into headaches or digestive problems. The most perverse thing is that repression disguises itself as virtue. A person who never gets angry may be celebrated as balanced, when in fact they live under the control of an aggressive impulse that has been so brutally suppressed that even they themselves are unaware of its existence. Their apparent serenity is not an achievement, it is a symptom. Freud discovered that these repressed contents do not remain quiet. They manifest themselves indirectly, like water finding cracks in a dam. They appear in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in selective forgetfulness, but mainly in symptoms. That migraine that always appears before important meetings may be the only way that repressed anger has found to express itself. That chronic procrastination in the face of creative projects may be the way that the fear of success, also repressed, has managed to sabotage achievement. Repression creates a double life. There is the person we believe ourselves to be, and there is that other subterranean person who acts through symptoms, sabotage choices, and repetitive patterns that seem to make no sense. The first lives in the light of consciousness, makes rational decisions, and constructs coherent narratives about themselves. The second inhabits the shadows and wields a power that the first does not even suspect. The process is even more subtle than it seems. It is not just a matter of pushing painful memories into the unconscious. Repression acts as an active filter that distorts the perception of present reality. Someone who has repressed experiences of abandonment in childhood may interpret neutral gestures from partners as signs of rejection, creating conflicts where none existed. The person is not remembering the past, they are reliving it disguised as the present. This mechanism explains why some people seem to always attract the same type of problem. It is not bad luck. It is not fate. It is repression working like an unconscious magnet, guiding seemingly rational choices towards situations that confirm old wounds that we do not even remember having suffered. The compulsion to repeat that Freud identified is not conscious masochism, but a desperate attempt by the unconscious to resolve traumas by reenacting them. Perhaps the cruelest example is the person who has spent their entire life trying to be good to compensate for a destructive impulse that was repressed in childhood. This forced goodness becomes a prison. It is not an authentic expression of generosity, but the result of unconscious terror at one's own capacity to cause harm. The person lives under the weight of guilt they don't even remember feeling, paying for crimes they don't even know they imagined committing. Repression also explains why certain people develop seemingly irrational phobias. Fear of heights may hide a repressed impulse to throw oneself off a cliff. Agoraphobia may be a defense against an unconscious desire to expose oneself completely. The symptom arises precisely to prevent the dangerous impulse from being realized, but at the same time reveals its existence in a coded form. And here is the central paradox. The more one consciously tries to control these impulses, the more power one gives them. It's like trying not to think about a pink elephant. The effort to avoid it only intensifies the presence of what one wants to deny. Repression, which should protect, ends up imprisoning. What should be a defense becomes a symptom. A person who has repressed their need for attention may become invisible, but develop a compulsion to work excessively, the only socially acceptable way to be seen. Those who have banned their sexuality may devote themselves obsessively to intellectual work, sublimating energy that they cannot assume. The denied impulse does not disappear. It just finds more sophisticated and less recognizable ways to express itself. This dynamic creates a specific type of suffering, the constant feeling of living a life that is not completely your own, of playing a role that has been imposed on you, of following a script written by forces unknown to you. It is the suffering of being governed by an invisible power that acts on our behalf, but without our consent. There is a silent negotiation that takes place in the early years of life, a contract that no one consciously signs, but which everyone religiously complies with. On the one hand, the promise of acceptance, love and belonging. On the other, the renunciation of parts of oneself that are deemed unacceptable by family and society. It is a seemingly advantageous exchange, sacrificing wild authenticity in the name of tamed civility. But this taming has a cost that only reveals itself decades later, when the person awakens and realizes that they have built an entire personality based on what they should not be, rather than what they really are. The mask has become so sophisticated that they have forgotten there was a face underneath. Freud understood that civilization is not just a set of external rules. It lives within each individual as an active force of self-control. The superego, this internalized moral authority, functions as a relentless judge who never rests, never forgives, never forgets. It judges not only actions but also thoughts, not only what was done but what was desired to be done. The result is a life built on denials. The person learns to say, "I'm not like that," with such conviction that they come to believe it. I'm not selfish, I'm not aggressive, I'm not needy, I'm not envious. Each "I'm not" is a small symbolic death, a piece of the original personality that has been sacrificed on the altar of social acceptability. But these denied impulses do not disappear. They disguise themselves. Repressed aggression can return as extreme perfectionism. Denied neediness can manifest as an obsessive need to be useful to everyone. Suppressed envy can turn into exaggerated generosity that functions as self-punishment. The person becomes a tamed version of themselves, polished until they lose their original contours. The most disturbing thing is to discover that many of the qualities we most admire in ourselves may be just well-disguised symptoms. That infinite patience may be unconscious terror of one's own anger. That constant humility may be fear of assuming one's own power. That unfailing kindness may be the result of terror at one's own capacity to hurt. There is a cruel irony in this process. The more someone tries to become morally perfect, the further they distance themselves from their own humanity. The pursuit of absolute goodness becomes a sophisticated form of self-violence. The person constantly polices themselves, censors every impulse that does not fit the internalized ideal, lives in an internal dictatorship where they are simultaneously the tyrant and the victim. This dynamic creates a peculiar kind of exhaustion. It is not just physical or mental fatigue, it is the existential exhaustion of someone who has spent years playing a character they did not choose. It is the fatigue of maintaining a constant performance, even when there is no audience. especially when there is no audience, because the internal judge never takes a vacation. Perhaps this is why so many people feel empty even when their lives seem functional. They have built an existence based on avoidance, denial, and no's that have accumulated to form a hollow identity. They live like tourists in their own lives, following scripts that have been imposed by voices they no longer even remember where they came from. The tragedy deepens when one realizes that these renunciations were made for approvals that never fully came. The conditional love of parents, which required the suppression of anger to be deserved. The acceptance of peers, which demanded the sacrifice of creative weirdness. Professional recognition, which only came when one gave up any spark of rebellion or questioning. Each concession seemed small at the time, but the accumulation of these small symbolic deaths resulted in an anemic existence. One looks back and cannot recognize who one was before learning to be who one should be. The authentic child was buried so early that sometimes there's not even a clear memory of what they were like. Repression in this context is not just an individual mechanism, it is a cultural phenomenon. Entire societies are built on what cannot be said, felt, or desired. There is a collective complicity in pretending that certain dimensions of human experience simply do not exist. And the more a culture represses certain impulses, the more those impulses return in distorted and destructive ways. Think about the professions we choose, the partners we attract, the places we decide to live. How many of these choices were made to affirm who we are, and how many were made to deny who we fear we are? How many yeses did we say that were actually disguised no's? No to what we repress, no to what we suppress, no to what we bury alive within ourselves. If you've ever wondered why some of your reactions seem to come from a place you don't recognize, why certain situations arouse disproportionate intensities, it may be because you are encountering fragments of what was banished long ago. Pieces of yourself that were censored so early that they never fully formed, but which continue to try to emerge. The price of inner civilization is not only the repression of bad impulses, it is also the loss of spontaneity, of genuine creativity, of the ability to feel fully. When you censor too much, when you control excessively, life loses color, intensity, flavor. It becomes a pastel-toned existence, safe but dull, acceptable but lifeless. And perhaps the most tragic thing is to realize that this bargain was not always worth it. Many people sacrificed essential parts of themselves for an acceptance that never fully came, for a love that always had conditions, for a belonging that required the renunciation of their own truth. They paid a high price for a commodity that turned out to be counterfeit. The question that emerges is devastatingly simple. If so much of our personality was built on denials, on fears, on repressed impulses disguised as virtues, then who are we really? And even more frightening, do we have the courage to find out? Symptoms are the language the unconscious uses when words are forbidden. They are insistent messengers of truths that have been banished from consciousness but refuse to remain silent. Every unexplained headache, every persistent insomnia, every seemingly irrational phobia is an undelivered letter, an urgent telegram from parts of ourselves that have been silenced but not destroyed. The body becomes the last refuge of honesty. When the mind learns to lie perfectly, when speech is tamed to the point of losing any trace of authenticity, the body still tells the truth. It somatizes what cannot be felt, dramatizes what cannot be expressed, screams what has been forbidden to whisper. A woman who has repressed all her anger may develop a migraine that prevents her from working on the very days when she should be confronting unfair situations. The body does for her what the civilized mind refuses to do. It creates an impossibility of participating in dynamics that violate her. The headache is not a defect. It is protection. It is not a disease. It is encrypted communication. There is a disturbing intelligence in symptoms. They choose the exact moment, the precise location, and the necessary intensity to prevent the person from continuing to ignore what has been repressed. A panic attack that always occurs before important presentations may be protecting someone who has repressed their fear of being judged. The symptom is not sabotage. It is a desperate attempt at communication. The most fascinating thing is to discover that many symptoms carry an almost poetic symbolic logic. Throat problems in those who cannot say no. Back pain in those who carry responsibilities that are not theirs. Insomnia in those who are afraid of losing the control they maintain during the day. The unconscious not only creates symptoms, it sculpts them with an artistic precision that would reveal Shakespeare. But perhaps the cruelest manifestation of repression is the compulsion to repeat, the tendency to always choose the same types of destructive relationships, to sabotage successes at the last moment, to create problems just when everything is going well. It is not conscious masochism. It is an unconscious attempt to resolve old traumas by reenacting them, as if it were possible to change the ending of a movie by watching it over and over again. A person who was abandoned in childhood may spend their entire life testing the love of others, provoking situations that confirm their worst fear, that they will be abandoned again. It's not that they want to suffer, it's that abandonment is the only form of love they recognize. Their unconscious mind prefers familiar pain to unknown happiness, because at least in pain they know where they stand. This compulsion explains why some individuals seem to attract tragedy like magnets. It's not bad luck, it's not fate, it's repression functioning as an internal navigation system that always guides them toward what confirms their oldest wounds. They don't consciously choose suffering, but their unconscious choices systematically conspire against their happiness. The symptom can also be a form of unconscious emotional blackmail. The migraine that always appears when difficult decisions must be made. The fatigue that miraculously appears when opportunities for growth arise. The body becomes an unwitting ally of the part of us that prefers the comfort zone of known suffering to the uncertainty of transformation. There is something almost comical in the way we treat our symptoms. We care for them like neurotic pets. We feed our anxiety with unnecessary worries. We water our guilt with daily self-sabotage. We walk around with our sadness as if it were an indispensable companion. We develop an intimate and codependent relationship with that which causes us suffering. Freud realized that many people develop an unconscious resistance to healing because the symptom, however painful, offers secondary advantages. Depression that justifies not having to face challenges. Anxiety that gives permission to avoid intimacy. Anger that keeps others at a safe distance. The symptom becomes an imperfect solution to problems that the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. Perhaps most disturbing is the discovery that some of our most striking personality traits are nothing more than sophisticated symptoms. That extreme shyness may be an unconscious terror of one's own power. That compulsive need to please may be a fear of discovering who we are when we stop performing. Personality reveals itself not as something solid and definitive, but as a collection of defensive strategies that have crystallized over time. And when the symptoms begin to speak louder than the voice of reason, when the body rebels against the tyranny of the civilized mind, a unique opportunity arises. The possibility of listening to what has been silenced, of recognizing what has been denied, of integrating what has been banished. But this requires courage, the courage to discover that we may not be who we thought we were. There is a moment in everyone's life when they are faced with an uncomfortable truth. What they tried hardest to avoid is exactly what most defines who they have become. It is not irony of fate. It is not cruel coincidence. It is the relentless logic of repression in action. What has been expelled through the front door always finds a back window to return through, transformed, disguised, but recognizable to those who have eyes to see. The person who has spent decades running away from their own anger will discover that they have chosen professions, partners, and situations that keep them in a constant state of contained irritation. The one who repressed their need for attention will build a life of invisibility that will cause them to suffer precisely from the lack of what they denied they desired. The banished impulse does not disappear. It becomes the secret architect of an entire existence. This discovery can be devastating or liberating, depending on how much courage one has to face it. Because recognizing repression is not just identifying a psychological mechanism, it is admitting that much of what we consider our personality may be just an elaborate escape strategy. It is accepting that perhaps we are not the authors of our own story, but characters playing a role written by forces we prefer not to know. The most disturbing thing is to discover that some of the most important decisions in life were made not to affirm who we are, but to deny who we fear we are. The marriage chosen to prove that we are not needy. The career embraced to demonstrate that we are not aggressive. The city where we decided to live to escape memories we no longer even know we have. Each seemingly rational choice reveals upon closer inspection a desperate attempt to keep at bay aspects of ourselves that have been judged unacceptable. Freud understood that repression is not a failure of the psychic system. It is its normal functioning. We all repress, we all live under the influence of unconscious content. We are all governed by forces we do not completely control. The question is not whether we have repressed content, but whether we have the courage to recognize it and integrate it in a less destructive way. There is a huge difference between healing and controlling. Most people seek more sophisticated ways to control their symptoms, manage their compulsions, and administer their neuroses. They want to be more efficient versions of who they already are, not more authentic versions. But repression cannot be resolved through control. It requires recognition, acceptance, and integration of what has been denied. This does not mean acting impulsively on every repressed desire, but it also does not mean continuing to pretend that they do not exist. It means finding mature and conscious ways to make room for aspects of ourselves that have been brutally censored. It means accepting that we are more complex, more contradictory, more human than our civilized self-image allows us to admit. True freedom does not lie in getting rid of repressed content, an impossible task, but in establishing a less neurotic relationship with it. Instead of constantly expending energy trying to keep them locked away, we can learn to live with their presence in a less destructive way. It is the difference between having a wild animal locked in a small cage, constantly growling, and having the same animal in a large space where its nature can express itself without causing harm. Repression teaches us that the human mind is much vaster and more mysterious than we imagine, that there are internal territories we have never explored, impulses we have never admitted, possibilities of being we have never considered, and that perhaps our neurosis is not a defect to be corrected, but a symptom of a psychic richness that has been compressed into a socially acceptable form. When you stop fighting repression and start listening to it, something surprising happens. The symptoms begin to lose intensity, not because they have been eliminated, but because they have been understood. The migraine that carried forbidden anger can turn into a healthy ability to set boundaries. The anxiety that protected against judgment can evolve into genuine creative sensitivity. The return of the denied does not have to be catastrophic. It can be revolutionary. It can be the moment when we finally stop being slaves to forces we do not know and begin to be partners with aspects of ourselves that we have learned to fear. It can be when we discover that what we feared most in ourselves may paradoxically be what we most needed to integrate in order to become whole. Ultimately, repression is not just about what we hide from ourselves. It is about what we hide from ourselves about ourselves. It is about refusing to accept that we are simultaneously angels and demons, saints and sinners, heroes and villains of our own stories. And that perhaps it is precisely in this contradiction, in this inescapable complexity, that our most authentic humanity resides. Perhaps the greatest repression is the repression of our own ability to be free, free to feel, to desire, to choose consciously instead of reacting compulsively. And when that repression finally dissolves, when we finally accept that we are much vaster than our personality allows, something extraordinary can happen. We can begin to live as if our life were truly ours. What is the impulse you try hardest to control, but that always finds a way to return? Write in the comments. If you've made it this far, you've already taken a step beyond most people. You watch the videos. You reflect on each idea. Now the question is, how far do you want to go with this? If you want to take the next step and truly apply this knowledge to your life, the codes of the White Rabbit are ready for you. The link is in the pinned comment. Remember, success is a decision. The choice is yours. Count on me and follow the White Rabbit.